Okay, now we're going into advanced HDR, and hang on, because it was all logical and easy and made sense, and everybody's nodding their heads. Yeah, it's a good idea. Now we're going to see what the problems are with actually doing it. So here are some of the related standards for HDR, and I'm going to go through each and every one. And no, I'm kidding. These are just some of the standards, however, that are involved in the development of HDR. Now, this is the new terminology, and I'm going to go over each and every one. No, I'm not going to do that either. But these are all new terms that you've probably never heard before. I'm not going to talk about each one of these, but I am going to talk about the most important of the new technology, which is transfer function. We've used the term gamma curve since the beginning of television. Gamma curve no longer applies because we're dealing with a purely digital signal, and we're dealing with a transfer function where we transfer from optical to electronic, OE. So that's the OETF, optical meaning the lens, and it comes out an electrical signal. At the display end, it's the opposite. It comes in electrical and goes out as an optical picture on the screen. The two combined are OOTF, sometimes referred to as glass to glass, from the lens to the TV screen. That's the entire system, and HDR is a system. You can't put it in the camera without having it on the display. And we also have a new term called nit, which is a candela per square meter, but a nit is a lot easier thing to say. So we need to talk about what are nits. Nits is a measure of brightness. When you go into a theater, it's almost entirely black, and a theater screen is actually about 48 nits. It's very dark, but the room is so dark, it still looks nice and bright. Your TV is actually twice the brightness of a movie theater screen. And yet we can do a whole lot more than that. That 100 nit was established in 1932. That's what sets the standard for 100 nits in all TVs. But TVs today can do a whole lot more than that, and we're unlocking that with HDR. This is the target for HDR, 1,000 nits. And Dolby Vision uses a 4,000 nit precision monitor for the director to look at. And as the director watches and does color and tone grading, those details go into metadata, which follows the video and goes to your TV and adjusts your TV to look like the director wanted it to. That's the key. And I'll get into a little more detail about it. This is a theoretical limit of 10,000 nits. Yes, 10,000 nits hurts. It hurts just like a sun reflecting off a windshield. And that's real life. So this is a theoretical limit. Nobody can do this, but it's where we're going. Right now, we're a little over 1,000 nits in some of the new LCD TVs. The key takeaway here is cinema and television, meaning home television viewing, are very different environments. If a cinema or a theater is completely controlled, a home viewing environment is completely uncontrolled. There's light spilling in from windows, the lamps are on, the program that you're watching is interrupted by interstitials, which changes everything. So we have two completely different viewing environments, and therefore it is likely that we'll have two different high dynamic range profiles, and I'll get into a little more detail on that. First thing you have to know is, why doesn't ATSC pass high dynamic range? Because it's 8-bit. You have to have more bits. If you don't have more bits, you get this contouring, you get this banding and stepping. So you have to have 10 bits minimum. Dolby Vision actually uses 12. Second thing is, you need to reallocate the bits. Our eye is very sensitive to mid and dark tones. This comes from caveman days where you needed to see a tiger in the shadows. Our eye is not very sensitive to bright and brighter. So we reallocate bits into this lower gamma range so that we make better use of the 10 bits that we have. Notice the difference in f-stops. The actual f-stop range of a standard dynamic range camera is 6 stops. Now, we make it look like more than that with all kinds of camera adjustments, but it's actually just 6 stops. And when you look at what high dynamic range can do, production people have an opportunity to unlock a huge amount of capability that they've never had before. Another way of looking at HDR is like this. As we move down the chain, we lose tonal range, we lose bits, we lose whatever as it moves down the range until what you have is a pasty picture like that. In high dynamic range, we don't lose much across the chain. You probably say, well, I've seen TV pictures that look really great. They don't look this bad. Well, that's true. I'm making a point. But the other thing is, until you see HDR side by side with SDR, you can't appreciate what the difference really is. How many people have been to Best Buy and seen an LG HDR? It's spectacular. Have you seen the queen with the gold gown on and the brass band? You simply can't reproduce those colors in standard television, and I'll tell you why in just a second. If you take a camera with high dynamic range and you connect it to a monitor with high dynamic range, it's easy. But that's not the real world. The real world is it has to pass through lots of things in an infrastructure, TV station being the worst. But even a OTT, which is pretty much the easiest, there are still steps along the way. There's playout servers and storage. If anything truncates the bits to 8, HDR is gone. So you have to maintain it all the way through. It's a system, and that is the importance of all the infrastructures. And until we get all the infrastructure there, we can't do HDR on the professional side. That is to say, currently Netflix, Amazon, a lot of over-the-top does HDR. They can because they have a fairly simple infrastructure. I wanted to touch very briefly on wide color gamut. Wide color gamut is not part of HD HDR, but you should be aware that no current monitor or TV can do SMPTE 2020 color. The best they can do is DCI-P3, and this is 2020 out here. DCI-P3 is here. This is, again, 2020 is a target, a future that we hope to arrive at, but none of the displays are capable of that now. So it's a good target, and you can see the main increases in green. The other way to look at color is in a 3D image like this. Television is an additive system, R, G, and B. What happens when you put R, G, and B together at full value? What do you get? White. You get white. So what happens if you have a bright thing on the screen that has deep saturated color? You can't. That's the problem with today's color volume here. When you get up here into this kind of color volume, that's where you can have a bright thing like a reflection off a brass instrument and still have color in it and not have it washed out by the luminance value. So that's the value of wide color gamut. This is the reference monitor today that we use in television. 1934, this is actually 1934 Dumont black and white 14-inch TV. That is the standard. This is BT 709. This display set the standard in 1934 that we adhere to today. Pretty pathetic, huh? In an industry that moves as fast as we do, how is this even possible? And the answer is compatibility. We'll get to that in just a second. But that's why. And again, calling your attention to modern displays and their ability to go to a higher luminance than the standard. 3 basic profiles in HDR. Hybrid log gamma, which is what we advocate. It's for live, real time. Dolby PQ and Dolby Vision. Dolby PQ is the same curve as Dolby Vision. Dolby Vision adds more metadata and adds 12-bit quantizing, but they are both the same curve. We like hybrid log gamma because it is a traditional approach. The brightest thing in the scene that the camera sees is the brightest thing your TV can do. Makes sense. With Dolby, the scene is actually recorded without a gamma curve. It's raw or linear, if you know what that means. And then it is tweaked in post-production. It is adjusted in post-production. The idea is, in post-production with color and tone grading, you could do a lot more control over the signal than you can with just a flat transfer function or gamma curve. And that's all great, but you can't do it live. So that is the problem with Dolby. Now, Dolby was developed for cinema, for movies, and it does a great job, but it won't work for sports. It won't work for live. Artistic intent is what I was talking about regarding Dolby and how the director looks at the picture, makes decisions, puts that information in metadata. That metadata travels to your TV and inquires as to what the TV is, whether it's HDR, whether it can handle this or not. The TV reports back, and then the metadata tells the TV, here's what I want you to look like. That's a lot going on, and if anything goes wrong along the way, it doesn't work. So that's a little bit of an issue. It is much less of an issue for like over-the-top and certainly packaged media. Ultra Blu-ray DVD has no problem. I mean, they're almost all Dolby Vision, and they look great, and it's a very simple thing. It's burned in the DVD, you put it in the player, it goes to the TV, it works. That's not a problem, but we're talking about live television. So, here's another picture of HDR on and off. You see what happens now in the dark areas. It's just driven into the mud and there's no detail there. This picture shows a lot more in the dark areas. I should tell you that these are simulated, right, because this isn't an HDR display, and that this picture would actually be 10 times brighter. That it wouldn't look like this in HDR. The same thing with this picture. This picture is 10 times brighter. It isn't just showing a greater range, but it's actually a brighter picture in the peak. The average picture level does not change, but it has much brighter peaks. And here in the clouds, this area would be about 10 times brighter. So we have about 1.4 billion TVs in the world. Of those TVs, 275 million are here in the US. Those TVs worldwide range dramatically from old crappy CRTs to the very latest OLED, HDR TVs. But we have to remain as compatible as possible with all of those TVs. And once again, this is where hybrid log gamma works better. First, it has no metadata, so there's nothing to get lost. And second, it's a more compatible curve for traditional SDR TVs. Now, the good and bad is, the better the picture performance, what happens to the compatibility? It gets worse. And that makes sense. It makes perfect sense. Because the harder you push HDR, the less compatible it's going to be with SDR. So that's another issue that you have to deal with. Now, if you're over the top, you're Amazon or Netflix, and you go to that part on the website and you select an HDR movie, well, they're pretty sure that you have an HDR TV because you went to the effort to select HDR. That's not a problem. You don't need compatibility there. If it's packaged media, you don't buy an HDR Blu-ray, Ultra Blu-ray, unless you have an HDR TV. Once again, it's not a problem. But for normal SDR watching, these are trade-offs that you have to deal with. I should also mention Dolby Vision is licensed and proprietary, and the manufacturers have to pay for a chip in the TVs, which they don't like. It's not very expensive, but they don't like it anyway. This is the gamma curve. This is what the CRT nonlinearity was. And so in the cameras, we had to compensate for that by putting an opposite curve leading to the red line. The red line is not perfectly linear, but it's close enough. So this is where the problem comes in. Now this is three of the curves. The red line is standard dynamic range. And if you take a second to study this, you can see that at 100 nits, it's 100 or 1 what I'll call IRE 100. Okay, IRE doesn't exist any more than gamma curve, but you know what I mean. So at 100 nits, it's 100 IRE. That is standard television today. These are two curves. HLG is blue and Dolby is green. So take a look at this and you can see, this is probably the most important slide in the whole deck. This slide shows that a modern, good, standard dynamic range TV can actually go up to almost 450 nits. It can. We don't let it. That's the key. Now we unlock that and we stop sending it 100 nit full brightness and we start sending it more, 450, 500, 600, whatever. That TV is going to do the best it can, and at its peak brightness, that curve is very close to full brightness. Dolby is not. Now I'll show you what that means. This is a $30,000 4K HDR monitor on the left, a $5,000 HD SDR monitor on the right. Could you watch either picture? Yeah. Is this one a little better, maybe a little bit better color? Yeah, $25,000 better. But the picture is acceptable on either side, and this is a hybrid log gamma curve that is very near full brightness. Now what happens when we look at the Dolby curve? Well, first thing that you'll notice here is the Dolby goes up faster, so that means right in this area you're going to have an increase in brightness in the darker areas, and because the curve tails off here, you have a decrease in brightness when it gets up to the higher brightness levels. So you're saying, well, what does that look like? This is what it looks like. You have a pasty, muddy, washed out picture. It has no contrast, essentially. It doesn't have dark areas and it doesn't have bright areas. Now, if you had the ability for this to go way on out to 1,000 nits, you would see the contrast. But at standard dynamic range brightness, it isn't there. One way to handle the compatibility issue is this slide by Tektronix, which says that we put metadata in what I'll call a sidecar, for lack of a better term. We pass standard dynamic range with high dynamic range in a sidecar. If your TV can handle high dynamic range, it disassembles the sidecar, adds it to the SDR, and voila, you have an HDR picture. It's a good idea. It's a little complicated, and so there are possibilities of problems here, but it's a good approach to do it, and in fact the Technicolor Advanced HDR does this as well. This is the metadata that is in the frame, again courtesy of Tektronix. This is what is being sent to the TV, telling the TV what to do. And again, any of this is lost or corrupted, your HDR doesn't exist. Another way to handle compatibility is by using a lookup table. 3D in this case is RGB. This approach, you start out with an HDR, that's the red line, and you go into a lookup table and you get SDR out of the HDR. You can do it in the CCU, you could do it here in a mobile truck, you could do it here at a master control. It can be done anywhere. And it's another way of getting what you might call a split feed of both SDR and HDR. There are claims that you can up-convert SDR to HDR. It's only an estimate. It's not ever going to be as good as real HDR, but Technicolor in particular has shown some pretty interesting things, but it is an up-conversion. So the UHD Alliance got together and said, we need to set some specs. Consumers are confused. So let's set these specifications, and if you conform to these, you notice it says 90% of DCI-P3, then nobody's doing 2020. If you conform to these, you can put this label on your TV, and then consumers would know that this is an HDR-capable TV. As soon as this was established, Sony and Samsung said, we're out. What? Wait a minute, you were founding members of this alliance. Yeah, but if we put this sticker on our TV, we'll just look like everybody else. We don't want that. A confused consumer is a good consumer. So this fell apart. It was a good idea. You might see this on an LG, which does conform and does use the sticker, but you don't see it on a lot of TVs. And there is a battle, of course, between LCD and OLED. LCD, which is sometimes erroneously called LED TVs, which is just the backlight. It's still an LCD. Has a peak brightness of up to 1,000. And it doesn't go real black, right? Because an LCD is just a shutter. It can never really shut off the backlight. OLED, however, emits light like a plasma, and therefore it goes like you turned it off black. OLEDs have not up until recently gone much above 540. The new LG OLED C6, C7 can go up to about 800 nits, so it's getting there. And the LCDs are getting brighter as well. Samsung is championing quantum dot. Anybody heard of quantum dot? Okay. And basically it adds more color and brightness to the picture in an effort to confuse consumers as much as possible. Samsung has said, we have LED TVs, which I already told you is a misnomer, and it has quantum dots. So what do you think they call that TV? QLED. Perfect. QLED. Very confusing, just exactly what they want. One of the things we have to do is get more HDR TVs out there. These are forecast worldwide, and you can see the dark blue is today's standard dynamic range UHD TVs. You can't buy a decent size HD TV anymore. So the UHD TVs with standard dynamic range are decreasing, and you can see the gain in one profile of HDR or all the profiles of HDR. In either case, they are HDR capable, and they're very bright and can handle the HDR signal. So there's about 115 million forecasted HDR TVs by 2020. And by then, we should see a real increase in the effort by production people to do HDR. By 2020, there will be ATSC 3.0 TV stations. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of them. And thanks, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it.